when Street Fighter 6 came out, I was kind of focusing on the traditional fighting game aspect. I talked about how the game wasn't competitively viable. I talked about how like the FG cucks were like shilling for the game, how like it clearly wasn't very good, and how like it wasn't really successful, and how Capcom was like trying to keep this thing relevant. And like, the game's not a month old yet, and it already feels like it's dead. I'm seeing like nobody talking about the game anymore, and it's kind of falling by the wayside. I imagine it'll be very quickly eclipsed by Mortal Kombat 1 and Tekken 8, which both look way better. And hopefully this is the beginning of the end of Street Fighter, and by extension Capcom, or at the very least the Sony dick sucking side of Capcom that we've been getting since the 90s. So hopefully this is the beginning of the end for Capcom, just like Final Fantasy 16 is the beginning of the end for Square Enix. But I haven't really seen any evidence for that yet. But there is no denying at this point that Street Fighter 6 is a bad game, which is one step at a time. Even if the company isn't dead yet, at the very least, we can see that like Street Fighter has had no major innovations. It hasn't evolved at all in 20 years. I just popped in my copy of like the Street Fighter 30th anniversary collection, and like I was surprised at how like the series seems to have peaked with like Third Strike, right? Like after that there's just not all that much like interesting about it. And even like the alpha games weren't very good. All the Street Fighter 2 revisions were unnecessary. Like the franchise has always been mismanaged, right? There's a reason why it's never been able to go into full 3D, and like why so many other franchises have taken off in like the past 20 years. It's because like Street Fighter is stagnant as hell, right? It can't make any changes because like the extremely autistic, devout, like, Street Fighter community don't like any change, don't want anything to change. And so, like, every Street Fighter release, they do the same thing where they just buy the game, hop online, and then like try to like find DSP and like beat the crap out of him, right? That's the entire FGC community, right? That is the fighting game community, is just buying a new fighting game, going online, and then like trying to play it until like people figure out the meta. And like, it's becoming like stale. It's becoming uninspired. It's becoming boring, right? And I talked about that like immediately after the game came out, but I failed to mention the fact that I did talk about this when the game was first shown off, but I failed to mention in my like general overview of the game's release that the online portion was not supposed to be the main focus of Street Fighter 6. Something that they put a lot of effort and time into, including like the first time the game was shown off, I believe, was emphasizing the single player mode. Like they were going to have a big sweeping campaign where like Luke goes around in a third person perspective and like interacts with Street Fighter characters, like Mortal Kombat Deception's Conquest mode, right? You were supposed to like train and like go through these missions, and like the single player was supposed to be good, right? We were supposed to have a good single player Street Fighter game for the first time ever in history. You wouldn't have to have a friend in order to play this game the way it was meant to be played. No. You would have like an entire adventure to go through. And nobody talks about the story mode at all. Nobody cares about it. Nobody addressed it. But like, I've looked into it, and I've seen a couple of clips, and it's shit. It is complete trash. Like every other fighting game campaign that isn't like a Super Smash Bros. Game. Like it is just completely terrible, right? ARMS had a better single player mode because ARMS has like that really cool like a secret final boss that you get when you beat the game on a high enough difficulty. Like ARMS was way better than Street Fighter 6, right? Street Fighter 6 is boring, and it just relies entirely on like decade-old memes. Oh man, did you know that Chun-Li's thighs are unusually huge? Like that's been a joke with the character since the 90s. Like why exactly are we doing this again? Like why is the character not grown or changed or evolved in 30 years? Like there's a reason why these days people are more into Jury. Because Jury actually like feels like in a new aspect of the Street Fighter canon that people are kind of into, right? Kind of. She's not a great character by any stretch of the imagination. People only like her for certain reasons, but it's something, right? Compared to the rest of the cast, which have always been forgettable, like uninspired, just boring, like national stereotypes. Not even like in a funny way, like Punch Out, like. Street Fighter has just always been has never been able to like establish a core cast of characters that are in any way interesting. Like people know Ken, Ryu, and Chun Li because they're iconic, but like Ken and Ken is a clone of Ryu, and like Chun Li, I like her a lot, but like if she's not in any good games, like you can't really get invested in the character. Like I would say the only reason I'm a fan of Chun Li is because of her portrayal in Project X Zone 2, is an amazing game by the way, which is top tier for fleshing out some of these underutilized characters from obscure IPs, right? Like Street Fighter, right? Like that is it really does feel like at this point, like I've been saying this since Street Fighter V, and I think even before that came out, but it really feels like Street Fighter is entirely reliant on like 90s nostalgia, right? You need these 40-year-old boomers, people like DSP, people like Max Dude, people like Low Tier God to like just get hyped for Street Fighter just because it's Street Fighter. Never mind that there are like dozens of better fighting game IPs out there. Never mind that the industry has like changed and evolved in the past 30 years. Never mind that like Street Fighter is stagnant and has had several like poor entries like since Street Fighter 2. Like, forget all of that because it's Street Fighter. That's what we're into, man. I'm the best there is at Street Fighter 2 in my local arcade. So this is a game that means a lot to me because it's the only time I've been the best at anything in my life. That's legit how these people act. Like people make fun of like DSP for like bragging about the Evo win and stuff like that, like the winning the mall tournament for Tekken 3, but like that is how these people think. Like that is the appeal of fighting games. Like when you take away that like feel that like that need, that drive to be the best. Like fighting games really don't have a lot of substance. They don't have a lot of replay value. They don't have a lot of reason to keep coming back, right? And like, I love fighting games, right? But like, lately people have been like calling out the speedrunner community for being like a bunch of autistic spurgs who waste their time like min-maxing their runs or whatever, like getting through the games as quickly as possible without really enjoying them. And I agree with that, but I think the same can also be said for the fighting game community. They are tryhards. They don't really register that like there's more to a game than simply like beating the person you're playing against, right? They don't. There's no like really thought. There's no real thought put into like the quality of like the lore of Street Fighter, how things evolve from game to game, how like the single player could be improved, how like things could be done to make Street Fighter more interesting, right? Because that would get in the way of like what makes Street Fighter popular, which is getting cucked by the fighting game community, right? Like that is the appeal for everyone involved is like the FGC, and it's just it's unbelievably frustrating because fighting games are probably the worst they've ever been, right? I mean, maybe in the mid 2000s they were worse, but like right now it feels like we're in kind of a rut with the fighting games, but these hardcore players, these people who like dedicated their lives to playing fighting games, like they really don't want to admit it. They don't want to admit that like these games have gotten worse. They don't want to admit that like they're stagnant, that we don't really need new fighting games. Like they don't want to admit that like there is no content, there is no replay value, like there's no personality anymore, there's no originality, there's no innovation in the genre. They just want to do their thing where they just let's buy the next fighting game and then get excited for the next fighting game. Like it's bizarre how often we see these games come and go and like nobody really talks about them anymore, right? Like Street Fighter V, it's for a lot of people, I'm sure, is a game that like nobody really remembers at all, right? And there's a reason for that because it's garbage. But like, I think the same can be said for like the alpha games, for a lot of the Street Fighter 2 revisions, for Street Fighter 4 to a certain extent. Like who remembers any of these games fondly, really? Like all that really matters to the street fighting community is being the best, and that hasn't been true since the 90s, if it was ever true at all.